Welcome to the debate.
Glad to be here.
So today we are dissecting a framework that really fundamentally alters how we perceive human interaction. It's called layered communication theory. The standard model of communication, the one we all sort of believe in, is that speech is for information transfer. I have a thought, I encode it, you hear it, you decode it, transaction's done. But the source material we're looking at today argues that this whole model is, well, it's a surface level illusion.
Right. It suggests that while we're all busy with the narrative, the what of the conversation, there's this whole other track running underneath simultaneously. The text calls it the structural layer.
And this isn't just subtext. I really want to be clear about that distinction, right from the start. We are not talking about reading between the lines or some vague emotional intuition. The material argues that this structural layer is a distinct executable operating system. It claims that through very specific linguistic tools, things like pronoun shifts, operator words, homophonic ambiguity, we are actually executing commands that govern our relationships, our hierarchy, our permissions.
Which, of course, brings us to the core question of our debate today. Is this structural layer truly a hidden programming language that runs human interaction? Is it, like the text says, executable code? Or is this maybe a dramatic, possibly overly technical rebranding of concepts we've understood for decades in linguistics? Pragmatics, speech act theory, just high-level social intelligence.
And I'll be taking the position that this is a distinct operational mode. The source material defines what it calls structural fluency, not just as a social skill, but as the ability to perceive and manipulate the source code of an interaction. If you're only listening to the dictionary definitions of words, you're just staring at the interface. But if you understand structural execution, you're rewriting the software while it's running.
And my argument will be that while the dynamics described are absolutely real, framing them as machine code is an unnecessary mystification. We can explain these phenomena perfectly well through semiotics and standard discourse analysis without having to treat every conversation like, a hacking attempt.
Okay, so let's get into the mechanics. The material leans very heavily on a concept it calls formal mapping. It argues language isn't primarily about transferring information, it's about structural execution.
But let's look at what formal mapping actually means. The text itself lists pragmatics and sociolinguistics as foundational. These aren't new fields.
It acknowledges them, yes, but the application is, I think, radically different. Pragmatics studies meaning in context. Layered communication identifies a mechanical operation. The text even uses the term relational geometry. When fluent participants, what the text calls magicians, speak, they are not just exchanging ideas. They are literally moving pieces on a board. They're using these operator shifts and reflexive pronouns to alter the hierarchy in the room. And the argument is that this happens whether people are consciously aware of it or not.
See, that's the word. Execute is the word I keep getting stuck on.
Why? It seems very precise to me.
Because execution implies a deterministic cause and effect. Almost like a computer script. If I input code A, I get result B. But human communication it's inherently probabilistic. The material even references Gricean implicature, which is just the academic way of saying we understand things that aren't explicitly said. So when you rebrand something like manners or flirtation as architectural protocols or control tokens, are we actually learning anything new, or are we just dressing up basic social skills in cyberpunk clothing?
I think we're learning about the mechanism of the result. Implication suggests a passive understanding. I imply, you infer. Execution implies an active status change in the relationship, and the text provides a concept here that I think really proves the point. Parallel semantic topology.
That is a dense phrase. Parallel semantic topology.
It refers to the ability to hold two completely distinct conversations at the same time, using the exact same stream of words. The text distinguishes this from subtext by saying, subtext is an emotional suggestion. Structural communication is a transactional reality.
Okay, let's test that. Give us the concrete example from the functional translation section.
All right, let's take a common professional phrase. I appreciate that I might take you up on it. Now, on the surface, the narrative layer, this is just a polite deferral. It means, thanks, maybe later.
Right, standard social nicety.
But the structural translation provided in the text is, I see your investment. I may return that support when positions reverse.
That seems to interpret a lot of intent from a simple throwaway phrase.
It's not about intent, it's about the reciprocity exchange key. The text argues that by using that specific phrase, take you up on it, the speaker is acknowledging a debt of attention without accepting the immediate offer. It is a specific, future allocation of resources. The structural layer treats this as a binding contract of attention.
I can see that. It's reciprocity. But let's look at the more controversial example the text gives about homophones, the phrase, no rush.
This is my favorite example because it perfectly illustrates the idea of executable code.
Or it perfectly illustrates overanalysis. Walk us through it.
Okay. On the surface, no rush is a negation, NO. It means do not hurry. But the text argues that the structural layer uses phonetic ambiguity. The brain just hears the sound no. In the structural layer, this can also act as no rush, KNOWRUSH.
So the translation is what exactly?
The structural translation is no rush, you have my time, you are authorized to draw from my bandwidth.
So you're suggesting that when someone texts me, no rush, they're effectively engaging in a psychological trick using the letter K.
I'm suggesting that the structural layer exploits the ambiguity of sound to bypass the critical faculty of the surface layer. It signals permission, KNOW, under the guise of negation, NO. It authorizes the usage of time. I mean, if I just said take your time, that's a command. If I say no rush, it's a release of pressure. The text calls this functional translation, and it proves the interaction is about authorizing resources, time, attention, not just being polite.
I will concede that the effect is resource authorization. I mean, when you tell someone, no rush, you are structurally de-escalating the urgency. But the mechanism still matters to me. The source material cites Umberto Eco and semiotics, and Eco teaches us that a sign is open to interpretation. So if I say no rush, and the other person is what the text calls a fool, they don't get the bandwidth permission. They just hear, don't hurry. The so-called execution fails if the receiver doesn't have the decoder key.
And that brings us perfectly to the second and I'd say most critical concept in this entire framework, the archetype of the fool.
The fool, I mean, it's a loaded term.
The material is very specific that we have to strip the judgment from it. It defines the fool not as an insult, but as a functional role. A fool is simply a participant who processes language only at the semantic surface. They believe the narrative content is the reality.
So a literalist, someone who just takes words at face value.
Someone who is structurally blind. And the argument is that power comes from structural asymmetry. If I am operating on the structural layer, moving pieces, establishing boundaries, testing positioning, and you are only listening to the literal definitions of my words, then you are vulnerable. The text says, control persists until structural perception emerges. The fool complies because they don't even see the boundaries being established.
My issue isn't with the phenomenon itself. We all know people who miss social cues. My issue is how binary it sounds. It suggests there are magicians who see the matrix and fools who are trapped in it. But isn't it possible that the so-called fool is simply someone who values the surface layer truth, clarity, directness, over the structural layer? Maybe they aren't blind. Maybe they just refuse to play the game.
The material addresses that refusal. It argues that the topology exists whether you participate or not. You can refuse to acknowledge gravity, but you will still fall. If you refuse to acknowledge the structural layer, you are, and this is a direct quote, governed by language you believe you are governing.
That is a very strong claim.
And the text offers a progression. It isn't just a binary. You start as the fool. Then, as your perceptual bandwidth increases, you become the wanderer.
The wanderer.
The wanderer senses the subchannel. They feel the tension in the room. They know no rush felt different than don't hurry, but they can't quite articulate why. They can detect the irregularities in the surface story, but they don't have the code to parse it.
That is a very relatable state. That feeling of something else is happening here, but I don't know what it is.
Exactly. And then, finally, the magician. This is where structural fluency stabilizes. The magician isn't necessarily a manipulator. They are just operating with high bandwidth perception. They see the interaction geometry. They understand that an apology isn't just an apology, it is a hierarchy reset.
Hierarchy reset. Interaction geometry. It's all very precise, very clinical language. And this approach, it extends to how the material treats basic human behaviors. I want to talk about the section on manners.
Ah, the linguistic control architecture.
Right. Most of us think of manners as, kindness or tradition. The text reframes them completely as signal standardization.
It reframes them as an onboarding protocol. The text argues that when we teach a child to say, may I or please, we aren't teaching them to be nice. We are installing a root-level protocol. We are forcing the child to acknowledge an authority gradient and to request permission before acting. It's role encoding.
It reduces the social contract to a system update. It views a child as a node in a network that needs to be calibrated to the operational grammar.
But think about the utility of that view. The text says manners reduce conflict noise. If everyone runs the same protocol, if everyone says please and thank you, the system just functions without friction. It creates predictable linguistic markers. If you view society as this massive chaotic network, then manners are the API that allows different nodes to interface without crashing each other.
Well, it's certainly an efficient way to look at it. It removes the emotion and just looks at the function. But that leads us straight to the section on flirtation, which I found to be the most rigorous application of this whole theory. It describes flirtation as alignment probing and risk distribution.
The bartender example is the key insight there. It is the perfect demonstration of parallel semantic topology.
Okay, set the scene for us.
You're at a bar with a potential partner. You turn and speak to the bartender, a third party. You make a joke, order a drink, maybe you banter a little. On the surface layer, you are just transacting with the staff.
Right. I'll have a gin and tonic.
But structurally, your tone, your wit, your command of the space, the way you hold your body, all of that is a message being directed at the partner who's standing right next to you. The text calls this dual addressing. You are maintaining a mundane surface conversation with the bartender to route relational signals to the target.
I agree that dual addressing is a real phenomena. We perform for an audience of one all the time. But the text frames this as testing relational thresholds. It says we do this to check the interpretive bandwidth of the partner without risking a direct rejection.
Exactly. It's a ping. If I joke with the bartender and you laugh, we are now structurally aligned. I know you got the code. If you look confused, or if you think I'm just being rude to the staff, I know you lack structural fluency, or you just aren't interested. But here's the genius of the structural layer. I haven't lost face.
Because on the surface, you are just talking to the bartender.
Correct. It is a risk mitigation strategy executed through channeled discipline. I didn't hit on you and get rejected, I just ordered a drink. The structural layer allows us to fail without consequence.
It creates a view of human connection that is entirely strategic, though. If we view every interaction as a control interface, we risk viewing our partners as puzzles that need to be solved.
Or we finally understand the mechanics of what we call chemistry.
Go on.
The text argues that what we call magic or a spark or clicking with someone is simply structural synchronization. When two magicians meet, two people fluent in this code, the interaction feels energized. It feels effortless. Not because of fate, but because both participants are running the same high-bandwidth protocols. They're reading the code, not just the screen. They catch the homophones. They understand the dual addressing.
That is a compelling, if a little unromantic, explanation for compatibility. It's basically data synchronization.
It's high-speed negotiation.
But I do want to push back on the magician versus fool dichotomy one last time before we finish. You suggest that once you see the structural layer, you can't unsee it.
Once the code is visible, the screen becomes transparent. That's the quote.
But there is a danger in overreading everything. If you're constantly analyzing pronoun orientation and operator shifts, you're engaging in a meta conversation that might not even exist for the other person. You might be playing 4D chess while the other person is genuinely just trying to order a coffee. You risk projecting structure onto chaos.
The text counters this by arguing the structure is inherent to language itself. It's not something we add, it's something that is. Every time you choose I versus we, you are defining a boundary. Every time you pause before answering a question, you're signaling something. The fool isn't safe just because they reject the premise. As the text says, they are governed by language they believe they are governing.
And that is the most haunting line in the entire material. The idea that if you don't speak the code, you are being programmed by it.
Which is exactly why I argue that structural fluency is essential. It isn't about manipulating others, though the text acknowledges that is possible. It's about defense. It's about having the perceptual bandwidth to see the transaction for what it truly is, to know when you're being positioned by a boss, or probed by a date, or calibrated by a social circle.
My final stance is really just a plea for balance. Use the lens. Understanding speech acts and dual addressing is incredibly powerful. It clarifies a lot of confusion. But we have to remember that the surface layer, the narrative, the literal promise, the simple joke, it has value. We aren't just operating systems. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and sometimes no rush really does just mean I don't need this right now.
A fair caution, but I think we can agree on the source material's final and major provocation. Communication may not occur within a single shared dimensional framework.
That I absolutely agree with. We are very often having two different conversations at the same time.
So the listener has to decide, when you hear a conversation next time, at work, with your spouse, on the news, are you just listening to the words, or are you hearing the machine code running underneath them?
And if you do hear the code, are you sure you have the right key?
Welcome to the structural layer. Thanks for listening.
See you next time.